I had a prosperous life full of blessings, a big family, many riches, and I always lived with integrity before God. However, my faith was tested in a way that very few people could endure. In one single day, I lost everything: my children, my material possessions, and finally my health. I found myself submerged in pain and despair, covered in sores, sitting in ashes, wondering why I was suffering so much. Hello, my name is Job, and this is my incredible story. After tragedy struck me, some friends came to comfort me, but instead of providing relief, they accused me of having committed some sin. Despite my doubts, my pain, and my anguish, I never let go of my faith in God, even though at the time I didn't understand what His plan was. In the end, God spoke to me from a whirlwind, showing me His infinite wisdom and reminding me that, although we don't always understand what happens, He is just and sovereign. After my trial, my life was restored, and God blessed me even more than before, with health, riches, and a new and beautiful family. I invite you to stay until the end to learn the full story of my life and gain valuable lessons for your spiritual growth. Hello, I am Job. My story begins in the land of Uz, a prosperous place full of blessings. I had a large family and many riches, thousands of sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys. My house was always filled with laughter and love. I was known by all for my integrity and my great devotion to God. Every morning, I offered sacrifices for my children, fearing they may have sinned in their hearts. My life was very good in every way, but the true test of my faith was about to begin. One day, without warning, everything changed. I still remember the brightness of the sun that morning, with no sign of what was to come. Suddenly, a messenger came running, pale and out of breath. The Sabaeans attacked and took your oxen and donkeys. They killed your servants, he said. He had not finished speaking when another arrived saying, "Fire fell from heaven and consumed your sheep and shepherds." I could barely comprehend it when a third messenger brought even worse news. The Chaldeans formed 3 bands, took your camels, and killed your servants. The final blow came with the 4th messenger. His words still echo painfully in my mind. Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking in the eldest brother's house when a strong wind caused the house to collapse, and they all died. My world fell apart. I fell to the ground, tore my clothes, and shaved my head in mourning. My heart was broken, but even in the midst of the pain, I found the strength to say, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." My suffering didn't end there. Satan, in a heavenly council, challenged my faith once again, saying, "A man will give all he has for his life. But stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." So I was afflicted with painful sores from head to toe. Sitting in ashes, I scratched my wounds with a broken piece of pottery. My wife, overwhelmed by all the pain, said to me, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." But I replied, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" At that time, most people believed that wealth was a sign of God's favor and that suffering was punishment for sin. My friends came to comfort me, but soon their words became a heavy burden. They accused me of hiding sins and told me to confess them to regain God's favor. But in my heart, I knew I had not sinned against Him. Today, looking back, I see that my story is not only one of suffering, but also of faith and perseverance. My losses taught me to trust in God's sovereignty, even when I didn't understand His ways. My life is proof that true faith is not demonstrated during easy times, but in how we face pain and adversity. I invite you to reflect on this. Sometimes, true devotion is not shown in times of prosperity, but in how we face the most difficult pain and trials. After everything fell apart in my life, my friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar came from afar to comfort me. When I saw them for the first time, their concern was obvious. They sat with me in silence for 7 days and 7 nights, sharing my pain without saying a word. Those moments of silence, with just their presence beside me, brought me some relief amidst so much suffering. But when I broke the silence, when I finally expressed my anguish and began asking questions, their responses were not what I expected. Each of them, in their own way, suggested I examine my life for some hidden sin that might have caused my misfortune. Eliphaz, the oldest and wisest of the 3, told me that suffering was the direct result of sin and that if I repented and returned to God, everything would improve without a doubt. Bildad, on the other hand, asserted that God's justice always prevails, whether to bless or to punish. According to him, my pain was necessary to purify my soul and restore my relationship with God. And then there was Zophar, the most passionate of them all, who also firmly believed that sin was behind my suffering. Their words, although well-intentioned, made me feel uncomfortable. I, on the other hand, remained convinced of my innocence. I knew my hands were clean before God, but even so, my friends' words weighed heavily on me. Hadn't I lived with righteousness and devotion? Weren't the righteous supposed to be rewarded, not punished? That question burned inside me as we debated over and over about the mystery of human suffering. In those days, nearly everyone believed that prosperity was a sign of God's favor and that suffering was a punishment for sin. The society I lived in followed strict religious rules that tied obedience to God with blessing. But in the midst of my doubts and struggles, I realized something deeper. God's justice is far greater and more complex than our minds can understand. Today, looking back, I realize that sometimes true comfort doesn't come from words, but from the simple presence of those who love us. Although my friends' words did not relieve my pain, the fact that they were with me reminded me of the importance of community and support in the darkest moments. After weeks of discussions with my friends, a new voice emerged among us, Elihu, a young man who had remained silent until that moment, listening to every word. His face showed a certain frustration as he heard us speak. Finally, he could no longer contain himself, and with passion, he raised his voice to express what he thought. "Elihu speaks," people whispered, as if it were the prelude to something great. With an energy that broke the silence, he began to tell us what he felt. He criticized us for talking so much without offering a clear answer about human suffering. He said that suffering is not always a punishment for sin, as many believe, but is often an opportunity to reflect and correct our ways. His words touched my heart. Elihu argued that pain can be a way for God to teach us humility and dependence on Him. He claimed that God is just and merciful and that His wisdom goes far beyond what we can understand. In the midst of my suffering, I found comfort in what he said. His fresh perspective made me question what we thought we knew. In those days, discussions were intense. We lived in a deeply religious society where the divine influenced everything, from temple rituals to daily life. However, I realized that true faith does not consist only in following external rules, but in sincerely seeking God's will, especially in difficult times. Looking back on those days, I realized that Elihu's words made me reflect and surrender to the reality that we don't always understand God's ways. Sometimes, in the midst of pain, we seek easy answers, forgetting that life is more complex and that we need a faith that goes beyond what we can see or understand. Elihu taught me that to draw closer to God, we must be willing to challenge what we believe and to listen to new ideas. After weeks of deep debates and reflections with my friends, when it seemed there were no more human answers, God Himself spoke from the whirlwind. I still remember it clearly. The wind began to swirl violently, lifting dust and leaves all around, while a powerful and majestic voice emerged from that whirlwind. "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge?" was the first thing I heard. At that moment, I felt a reverent fear that made me fall to my knees on the ground. God continued speaking to me, asking questions that revealed the greatness of His creation and how limited my understanding was. He reminded me that He is in control of everything, from the heavens to the depths of the earth. In that instant, all my doubts and questions vanished before God's immensity and mystery. I understood that my suffering and my understanding were just a small part of His great plan. With humility, I repented for my words and my attitude toward Him, acknowledging that His wisdom goes far beyond any human explanation and that His justice is above what we can comprehend. In the society where we lived, everything revolved around religion and beliefs about God's justice. From the sacrifices on the altars to the laws that governed our daily lives, everything was imbued with devotion to the Creator. However, in the midst of my own suffering, I discovered that truly knowing God is not just about following rituals, but understanding His character and His will. Now, I realize that true wisdom lies in recognizing our limitations and surrendering to the greatness of the One who created us. In moments of pain and confusion, we often seek quick and easy answers, forgetting that having faith means trusting in God, even when we cannot understand His ways. After God spoke from the whirlwind, everything changed. The silence that followed brought peace to my soul, which was in such great need. My friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar remained silent before God's presence and words. As for me, I felt deeply humbled, kneeling in the dust, fully aware of the greatness and power of the Almighty. God did not give me direct answers about why I suffered, but His presence taught me something much greater. His wisdom is infinite, and His justice goes beyond what we can understand. In that moment, all my complaints and questions disappeared, and I understood that His plan for me, though mysterious, was perfect and had a purpose. After speaking to me, God addressed my friends and rebuked them for not speaking rightly about him. He asked them to offer sacrifices for their wrongdoing. I felt great peace seeing how God defended my case and restored my honor before those who had doubted my integrity. God blessed the rest of my life more than I could have ever imagined. He restored double the riches I had lost: 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys. My children who had died were replaced by 7 sons and 3 daughters, who became my greatest joy and pride. The entire region admired my daughters for their beauty, grace, and wisdom. I lived another 140 years after that dark period, seeing my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren grow up. My life became a living testimony of God's faithfulness and restoring power. Every day of my remaining years was a reminder of His goodness and mercy, even after going through the most difficult trials. In my society, people strictly followed religious traditions and believed that suffering was a punishment for sin. My experience challenged those beliefs. I learned that true faith does not depend on external circumstances, but on personal trust in God, even in the midst of pain. Looking back at my life, I see that every stage, from prosperity to loss and finally to restoration, was guided by the loving and sovereign hand of God. He even used my darkest moments to show His glory and grace. My story is an invitation to trust that, although suffering may be part of our journey, hope and restoration are assured for those who trust in Him. My name is Job, and this has been my surprising story. I have lived through extreme moments, from the greatest abundance to losing everything in a single day, from illness to divine restoration. Throughout my life, I have seen God's power and grace at work. My story is not only one of suffering and recovery, but a testimony of how faith can sustain us in the darkest moments and change the way we see God and ourselves. One of the most important lessons I've learned is the sovereignty of God over all creation. Many times, we want to understand why we suffer and search for answers, but I've come to realize that God's wisdom is beyond what we can comprehend. By accepting that God is in control, we find peace, even when we don't understand what's happening. I also learned the importance of integrity and perseverance in faith. During my trials, I faced accusations from my friends and struggled with my own doubts, but I never stopped trusting in God's justice or in my own innocence. Integrity is something precious that strengthens our relationship with God and with others, even in the most difficult times. Finally, my story shows the power of divine restoration. After all that I had lost, God not only returned my possessions but also renewed my hope and joy. He allowed me to live many more years, seeing my children and grandchildren prosper. This restoration is proof that, although we go through difficult times, God always has a plan of redemption for those who trust in Him. To grow spiritually, we can apply these lessons in several ways. First, by deeply trusting in God's sovereignty, we learn to rest in His will, knowing He always has a purpose. Second, by living with integrity and devotion, we strengthen our relationship with God and build strong bonds with those around us. And third, by maintaining hope and divine restoration, we find comfort and perseverance during trials, knowing that God is always working for our good. May my story be a beacon of hope and faith for those going through difficult times, and may you find in God the strength to continue and the peace that surpasses all understanding.